Greetings, everyone. Have you ever wondered what the price of sacrifice is when it's met only with the cold betrayal of those closest to you? Today's story is not just about the daily grind at a distant fish farm, but a journey to reclaim justice, love, and secrets buried for years. A tale of resilience and unexpected kindness. The afternoon in the suburbs was strangely melancholic. Gray clouds hung low over the tree line, carrying the heavy moisture of a looming forest rain. On a secluded trail leading deep into the woods, where only the rustle of dry leaves and the hum of insects echoed, a small figure worked tirelessly beneath the canopy of ancient trees. It was Tao. Her hands were stained purple with plant sap, and her old, worn-out clothes were drenched in sweat despite the cooling air. She dared not rest. Every bunch of wild vegetables she gathered was her only hope for buying a can of energy drink or a few packs of instant noodles to survive the day. She had spent 5 years of her youth working to pay off her in-laws' debts, only to be cast out onto the street like an object that had outlived its usefulness once the debt was cleared. She wandered, carrying the pain of losing contact with her elderly mother and a heart riddled with scars. "Hey there, it's about to pour. You should stop now and head back." The sputter of an old motorcycle engine broke the forest's silence. Kwong turned off the ignition, kicked down the stand, and walked over. Dressed in his engineering uniform from the nearby fish farm, his face was tanned by the sun, but his eyes radiated a gentle, trustworthy light. He had been observing this girl for several days, always alone in the deep woods, her eyes perpetually clouded with sadness, yet her hands never ceased their labor. Dao startled. Instinctively, she took a step back, her gaze sharp with suspicion. Betrayal from those closest to her had taught her a harsh lesson. Never trust anyone, especially strangers. Recognizing her hesitation, Kwong stopped at a respectful distance, his voice calm and warm. "I work at the fish farm just downstream. I noticed you've gathered quite a lot. It's a long walk to the market with all that weight. If you don't mind, let me give you a ride to the main road. It'll be easier to sell them there." Dao looked down at the 3 large bundles of wild greens, then back at her own frail shoulders. She was truly exhausted. After a moment of reluctance, she nodded slightly, her voice as faint as the wind. "Thank you. I'm just afraid of getting your bike dirty." Kwong laughed heartily, taking the initiative to lift the heavy bundles onto the back of his bike. "It's an engineer's bike, ma'am. A little dirt won't hurt. Hop on. I'll take you to buy some seeds as well. I heard you wanted to start your own garden, right?" On that old motorcycle, amidst the wind whistling past her ears, Dao felt a spark of selfless kindness for the first time in years. She didn't know who this man was, but his simple concern acted like a soothing balm on her bleeding soul. They rode toward the horizon, where the flickering light was slowly being swallowed by the darkness, beginning a fated connection that neither of them could have ever foreseen. Early morning at the fish farm, the air was thick with mist. The rhythmic hum of the water pumps created a steady but monotonous soundtrack. The engineer had been there since dawn, checking filter tanks and oxygen levels. He had performed this task for 5 years, with the same meticulousness and responsibility that defined his character. "Kwang, why are you in so early today? I bought extra sticky rice. Come eat with me." Lan approached with a bright smile, holding a warm bag of breakfast. A long-time employee here, she prided herself on her sharp looks and cleverness. In the eyes of their colleagues, Lan and Kwong were a perfect match for the farm, even though he had never officially confirmed any relationship between them. He offered a small smile, wiping his wet hands on his protective vest. "Thanks, Lon, but I already ate at home. You go ahead before it gets cold. Remember to check the water level in tank number 3 today. It looked a bit low to me." His polite but clear refusal made Lon's smile falter. She was about to say more when she saw Dao's silhouette trudging through the farm gates. Dao was still wearing her old clothes, but her face looked less haggard than yesterday, likely thanks to her first peaceful sleep after days of wandering. The engineer's gaze shifted instantly. The cold professionalism he usually wore vanished, replaced by an evident tenderness. "Dao, you're here? I've asked the warehouse manager to set you up in the tank cleaning and worm sorting area this morning. The work is a bit heavy. Let me know if it gets too much for you." Dao lowered her head slightly, her voice barely a whisper.
"Yes, I can do it. Thank you for helping me find work."
Witnessing this, Lon's eyes narrowed with suspicion. She had never seen him show such concern for a stranger, especially one who looked as ragged and plain as this newcomer. His attention toward Daw was like a thorn in Lon's pride. "Kwong, the farm rules say we shouldn't just hire outsiders randomly." She looks so frail. How is she going to handle the temperature in the worm tanks? Lon spoke up, her voice sharp with a hint of sarcasm. He turned to look at Lon, his expression becoming more stern. "I've vouched for her with the director. Everyone deserves a chance, don't they?" As he led Dao toward the technical area, Lon stood behind, her hands clenching the now cold bag of sticky rice. A surge of insecurity and jealousy rose within her. In her mind, this farm was her domain, and that man was her ultimate prize. Lon vowed that she wouldn't let any stranger disrupt that order. The first undercurrents had begun to stir beneath the quiet surface of the fish farm. After a grueling day at the worm tanks, Dao was exhausted, yet she felt a sense of relief. The sunset descended, staining the long rows of fish tanks in deep shades of crimson. Kwong brought her some dry firewood to warm the makeshift hut near the technical area. The two sat by the crackling fire, its heat pushing back the creeping chill of the approaching night. "Have something to eat. You've worked all day," Kwong said, handing Dao a bowl of white rice with a few simple pieces of braised tofu. Dao took it, her hands trembling slightly from fatigue. She took a bite, and suddenly, tears began to stream down her face. "This meal, it tastes just like what my mother used to cook. She often braised tofu with soy sauce, just like this." Kwong listened in silence. He knew that beneath her submissive exterior lay a long story. He asked softly, "Why were you gathering wild vegetables alone? Does your family not come with you?" Choking back sobs, the emotions Dao had suppressed for so long finally broke free.
"I have no home to go back to, sir. 5 years ago, when I got married, my husband's family was buried in debt. I worked like a beast of burden day and night to pay it all off for them. I thought that once the debt was gone, I would have a happy family. But no. The moment the last penny was paid, my husband kicked me out. He said I was too old and held no value anymore." She wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "What hurts the most is my mother. Her name is Thu, and she's 60 years old.
Because she saw how hard I struggled, she sold our only house in the countryside to give me money for the debt. And then she disappeared. I don't know where she went. I lost my phone, lost all contact. Now I'm all alone, wandering and searching for her in vain." Kwang clenched his fists, feeling the profound pain of the girl across from him. He had been at this farm for 5 years and had met many people, but none with a fate as cruel as Dao's. He stared into the fire, his voice steady. "Don't cry anymore. Now that you have work here, just save your money. I will help you find your mother. Mrs. Thu is 60. She couldn't have gone too far. This world is vast, but kind hearts always find a way to meet." Dao looked up at Kwang. In the flickering firelight, she saw a spark of hope. For the first time in years, a man did not look at her as a money-making tool, but with the most sincere empathy. Night fell, wrapping the fish farm in an eerie silence, broken only by the distant hum of the aeration pumps. After her conversation with Kwang, Dao returned to the makeshift hut near the farm's fence. Once a storage shed for old equipment, it had been hastily cleaned to give her a place to rest. The wind whistling through the gaps in the bamboo walls kept Dao from sleeping. Every time the dogs barked near the main gate, her heart tightened. She feared her ex-husband would find her, or that the darkness would swallow the fragile hope she had just started to build. Dao clutched a small cloth bag, the only thing she managed to keep from her old home, containing a yellowed photograph of Mrs. Thu. She whispered into the dark,
"Mom, I found a good person. Where are you now?"
Meanwhile, in the staff quarters, Lon stood by the window, her gaze fixed on Dao's hut. Jealousy, like a slow-acting poison, was seeping into her mind. Lon couldn't understand why an elite engineer like Kwang, a man she had pursued for 3 years, would show such special concern for a ragged woman with rough hands like Dao. "She must be using that pitiful look to deceive Kwang," Lon muttered, her hands gripping the windowsill. The next morning, Lon began her plan. Instead of direct confrontation, she used fake concern to isolate Dao. Lon intentionally told other workers about Dao being kicked out by her husband for being worthless, causing whispers to spread throughout the farm. Whenever Dao passed by, the glances she received were no longer just curious, but tinged with mockery and contempt. Not stopping there, Lon sneaked into the worm tank area while Dao was busy cleaning at the far end. She deliberately turned the water valve too high, causing the tanks to overflow and ruining the entire sorting process that Dao had meticulously worked on all morning. When Kwang came to inspect and saw the chaos, Lon appeared immediately, her voice feigning worry. "Look, Kwang, I told you she lacked experience. If she ruins even simple tasks like this, what if it affects the whole farm's production?" Dao stood there, her hands wet and trembling, not understanding why the water had suddenly surged. She looked at Kwang, her eyes filled with the fear that he would be disappointed and fire her. But Kwang didn't scold her. He silently looked at the water valve, a valve he knew very well could not open by itself without someone's touch. After the water overflow incident at the worm tanks, Kwang did not blame Dao. He silently inspected the valve system and noticed fresh scratches on the handle, traces of intentional external tampering. He glanced toward Lon, who stood triumphantly in the distance. His eyes narrowed thoughtfully, yet he maintained his usual calm. "Don't worry, Dao. A little water won't ruin everything," Kwang said, his hands quickly readjusting the discharge valve. "Dry yourself off so you don't catch a cold. I have something to show you tonight." That evening, after the other workers had retired to their quarters, Kwang brought a small paper bag to Dao's hut. Inside was not food, but a stack of lists printed from the office computer. "I asked a friend at the district post office to do some digging. Kwong lowered his voice. "There was a recurring money transfer from an address in the Northern Highlands sent to your ex-husband's old account 2 months ago. The sender's name is Win T2. Is that your mother's name?" Dao's hands trembled as she held the paper, tears welling up again.
That is her name.
"But why is she all the way in the Northern Highlands?" "She sold the house to pay my debts. Why wouldn't she come to me instead of hiding so far away?" Kwong sighed, his eyes filled with pity. "I suspect Mrs. Thu didn't want to be a burden to you. Or perhaps she's working to scrape together the last of the money. Mothers have a way of sacrificing that we can never fully comprehend." While the two were absorbed in the new lead, Long's dark shadow lurked behind a nearby grove. She had heard everything. She gritted her teeth, seeing Kwong take Dao's trembling hands to comfort her. A more sinister plan formed in Lan's mind. If Dao was searching for her mother, Lan would turn that search into a nightmare. "Let's see if you have the heart to find your mother when you yourself are kicked out of here for theft," Lan whispered. A bitter smile etched on her face under the dim moonlight. On Monday morning, the atmosphere at the fish farm suddenly became unusually tense. An urgent announcement from the management was released. Special fish fry samples for the new research project have died en masse due to water contamination with a strange impurity. This project was the result of months of hard work by Kwong and his fellow engineers. Amidst the confusion, Lan stepped into the office, her face masked in fake panic. In her hand, she held a small vial containing a strange colored liquid. "Kwong, I don't want to say this, but early this morning, while checking the supply warehouse, I saw Dao sneaking around near the central filtration tank. After she left, I found this vial dropped nearby." All eyes turned to Dao, who stood in the corner of the room, her clothes stained with mud from the worm tanks. Dao was shell-shocked, stammering. I didn't do it. This morning I only went to pick wild vegetables to prepare lunch for everyone. I have never gone near the filtration area." Lan immediately added, "Picking vegetables? Or are you so resentful because your husband kicked you out, because life is unfair, that you want to sabotage others' hard work? You're new here. Who knows what your true intentions are?" The surrounding workers began to whisper loudly. The rumors Lan had been sowing for so long now erupted into open hostility. They looked at Dao as if she were a criminal. Kwong stood in the center of the crowd, his face hardened. He took the vial from Lan, examined it closely, and then looked at Dao. He saw her shoulders trembling, her eyes filled with indignation, but devoid of any guilt. However, the evidence Lan presented aligned too perfectly with the incident. "Dao, you must temporarily stop all work," Kwong spoke, his voice so cold it made Dao's chest ache. "I need to check the surveillance cameras and report to the director. During this time, you are not permitted to leave the hut." Lan flashed a hidden smile as she watched Dao collapse in shame. She felt triumphant, having finally backed Dao into a corner. However, Lan didn't notice that when Kwong held the vial, he recognized a familiar scent. The cheap perfume Lan wore every day. A scent that had accidentally rubbed onto the cap while she was staging the scene. That night, the forest rain poured down on the fish farm more violently than ever. Dao sat huddled in her dark hut, the sound of the rain drumming on the tin roof echoing Lan's harsh accusations in her mind. She felt like a small fish washed out of the current, lost and waiting for death on the dry flats.
Why is kindness so difficult?
Dao sobbed, her thin hands tightly entwined. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She was only afraid that the sole trust she had in Kwong would vanish. If he, too, believed she was a saboteur, she would have no reason left to stay on this land. Meanwhile, in the technical office, Kwong had not yet slept. He was meticulously reviewing data from the water quality sensors. He noticed something unusual. The impurity in the filter tank wasn't a standard industrial chemical, but a high-concentration hair essence. Something only someone as conscious of their appearance as Lan would regularly use. The next morning, while Lan was gleefully preparing a report for the director to sign Dao's termination papers, Kwong called her into the laboratory. "Lan, do you recognize this scent?" Kwong held the evidence vial near her nose. Lan paled slightly, but tried to maintain her composure.
I told you, I found it near where Dao was standing.
"It's probably some poison she found in the forest." Kwong gave a cold smile, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "This isn't poison. This is high-end hair oil, the exact type you ordered online last week. I saw the courier hand it to you myself. And more importantly, the fingerprints on this cap are very clear. Do you want me to take this to the district police for comparison?" Lan's face turned white as a sheet. She stammered, unable to form a sentence. Just then, Kwong's phone rang. It was his friend from the post office. "Kwong, about that address for Mrs. Thu. They reported back that she is hospitalized in a northern border province, and her condition is quite serious. Tell the girl to go there immediately." Kwong stood up abruptly. He had no time to punish Lan right now. He ran as fast as he could toward the hut, ignoring the bewildered looks of the surrounding workers. He had to get Dao out of there right away. Kwong burst through the door of the hut, his breath coming in short gasps. Dao looked up at him, her eyes swollen from a night of crying. Before she could ask anything, Kwong took her hand, his voice firm. "Dao, pack your things right now. There's news about your mother. She's in a hospital in the border province. We have to go immediately." Dao was stunned, the cloth bag containing her mother's photo falling to the floor.
My mother. What happened to her, sir?
"They say she's suffering from exhaustion and severe pneumonia. Don't ask any more questions. Hurry up," Kwong said as he helped her pick up the photograph. As they stepped out of the hut, Lan was already standing there with 2 farm security guards. She wore a triumphant smirk, holding the termination papers in her hand. "Kwong, where do you think you're taking this saboteur? The director has already signed her dismissal. Moreover, she hasn't compensated for the dead fish fry yet. No one is allowed to leave." Kwong stopped, his eyes cold as ice as he looked directly at Lan. He slowly pulled out his phone and played a video he had just retrieved from a hidden camera in a dark corner of the supply warehouse, one Lan knew nothing about. In the video, Lan was seen surreptitiously pouring a liquid into the filtration system, her face twisted with malice under the dim light. "Lan, these papers should be for you instead," Kwong growled. "I've already sent this video to the director and the local police. If you stay in our way, your charges won't just be property damage, but also slander and harassment." Lan collapsed to her knees, the papers slipping from her hand and blowing away in the wind. The 2 guards looked at each other and stepped aside, clearing the path.
Kwang didn't spare her another glance as he led Dao to the old motorcycle, which was already idling. The rain continued to pour, and the road out of the fish farm was blurred by mist. Dao sat behind Kwang, clutching the edge of his protective vest. Amidst the bone-chilling cold of the forest rain, for the first time after 5 bitter years, she felt she was no longer alone.
Ahead was a long journey, but with the protection of this steady engineer, she believed she would find her mother and find the light at the end of the tunnel. Kwang's old motorcycle raced through the white veil of rain in the northern highlands. Dao sat behind him, clutching his vest tightly, her heart burning with anxiety. After more than 5 hours of navigating treacherous mountain passes, they finally arrived at the Provincial General Hospital. In the hospital corridor, thick with the smell of disinfectant, Dao walked with trembling steps. As the door to room 402 opened, she saw a frail, small figure tucked away amidst the stark white blankets. It was Mrs. Thu. Her face was gaunt, and her hair had turned much whiter since the last time Dao saw her.
Mom!
"Oh, Mom!" Dao collapsed by the hospital bed, sobbing uncontrollably. Mrs. Thu slowly opened her eyes, her thin, calloused hands trembling as she touched her daughter's hair.
Is that you, Dao? How did you find me here?
At that moment, a doctor entered and quietly called Kwang outside. He sighed and said, "The elderly woman is suffering from severe physical exhaustion due to prolonged overwork and malnutrition. We also found a stack of money transfer receipts and a small savings book in her daughter's name inside her coat pocket. It seems she has been working as a hired laborer on the coffee plantations up here to scrape together money for her daughter." Dao heard everything. She realized with a shock that all this time her mother hadn't sold the house to abandon her, but to protect her from the debt collectors of her husband's family. She had hidden away because she feared that if she stayed, every penny she worked so hard for would be snatched away by Dao's wretched husband. Kwang stepped closer, placing a hand on Dao's shoulder to give her strength. He looked at Mrs. Thu with deep respect. "Rest assured, ma'am. From now on, I will take care of Dao. We won't let you suffer anymore." Mrs. Thu looked at Kwang, then at her daughter, a weak smile forming on her lips. Meanwhile, Dao held her mother's hand tightly. Her resentment toward the past seemed to vanish, replaced by a fierce determination. She would rebuild her life, not just for herself, but for the mother who had sacrificed everything for her. However, just as peace began to flicker, Kwang's phone vibrated. A message from a colleague at the farm arrived. "Kwang, Lan fled the farm after being caught, but someone saw her traveling with a man who looks exactly like Dao's ex-husband. Be careful." In the provincial hospital lobby, the night sky remained gray, pouring down heavy sheets of rain. As Kwang returned to the ward after paying the hospital fees, he witnessed a chaotic scene. A rowdy man, reeking of alcohol, was dragging Dao into the middle of the corridor. Beside him stood Lan, her arms crossed with a triumphant and malicious smirk. "Did you think I couldn't find you just because you hid up here?" The man, Dao's ex-husband, roared. "How much money did your old lady get from selling that house? Hand it all over. My family's debt is all because of your jinxed life." Dao stood firmly in front of the ward door. Although her face was pale with exhaustion, her eyes burned with an unprecedented determination. She growled, "Get out. 5 years of working like a slave to pay your family's debts was more than enough. The money from my mother selling the house was already given to you. She's dying inside. What more do you want?" Lan stepped forward, her voice dripping with sarcasm.
Oh, Dao, where did you get the money for such expensive hospital fees? Or are you using that pitiful act to drain Kwang's pocket? Kwang is just being deceived by you. Let's see if he still protects you once he knows you're just a discarded wife buried in debt.
Just as the ex-husband raised his hand to slap Dao, a firm hand gripped his wrist, twisting it back and making him howl in pain. Kwang had arrived. His eyes, usually calm, were now as cold as a razor blade. "This is a hospital, not a place for your thuggery," Kwang said, his voice low but commanding. He turned to Lan. "Lan, I've already reported your property damage at the farm to the police. And as for you," he looked at the ex-husband, "this assault and extortion are enough to put you behind bars for a few years." Lan turned pale and tried to pull the ex-husband away to flee, but the hospital security arrived just in time at Kwang's request. As they were being led away, the ex-husband continued to curse, but Dao was no longer afraid. She turned to see her mother lying peacefully in bed, then looked at Kwang. She realized that to protect those she loved, she could no longer be a gentle stream, but a powerful wave. The rain outside continued to fall, but inside Dao's heart, the fear of the last 5 years had completely vanished. After the horrific night in the hospital corridor, peace finally returned to room 402. Thanks to Kwang's timely intervention and the dedicated care of the doctors, Mrs. Thu's health began to show positive signs. Her persistent coughs subsided, and her eyes regained a flicker of the light of life. Every day, Dao stayed by her mother's bedside. She was no longer the secluded, frightened girl from the deep forest. She tenderly fed her mother spoonfuls of porridge, telling her about the fish farm, the kind colleagues, and especially the engineer who had saved her life.
Mom, Kwang said that once you're fully recovered, he'll take us both back to the farm. The air is fresh there. You can help me plant vegetables and raise chickens. We will never have to wander again, Dao said, clutching her mother's thin hand.
Mrs. Thu smiled, her gaze shifting to Kwang, who sat quietly peeling fruit in the corner of the room. She whispered softly,
"I'm old now. I want nothing more than to see you at peace. Kwang is a decent man. You must cherish him."
Kwang looked up, his trademark gentle smile on his lips. "Don't worry, ma'am. I've spoken with the farm director. He's very happy to have you come there to recuperate. Lan has been fired and is facing legal consequences, and Dao's ex-husband is being questioned by the police for extortion. From now on, no one will be able to disturb your lives." That afternoon, the pale golden sunlight of the highlands poured through the hospital window. Kwang took Dao out to the balcony so she could have a moment to breathe the fresh air. He pulled a small packet from his pocket. It was the vegetable and sunflower seeds they had bought together on the very first day they met. "These seeds, shall we plant them together?" Kwang asked, his eyes holding a silent vow. Dao looked at the tiny seeds in her palm, then into Kwang's warm eyes. She understood that these were not just seeds for plants, but the seeds of a new life she had always dreamed of. A month after leaving the hospital, Dao and her mother returned to the fish farm. On the day of their return, the sky was exceptionally clear, and warm sunlight stretched across the water tanks, shimmering like tiny diamonds. Kwang had been waiting for them at the gate since early morning, standing alongside colleagues who now looked at Dao with apologetic and welcoming eyes. Lan had received a fitting sentence for her acts of sabotage and slander, and Dao's ex-husband was also dealt with for extortion and assault. The fish farm became more peaceful than ever now that the undercurrents of jealousy had been swept away. Mrs. Thu was settled into a cozy, well-equipped small room right next to the garden area behind the farm. Her health had fully recovered, and her cheeks began to regain their rosy color. Every day she helped Dao tend to the vegetable garden and a small flock of chickens. The life the two had always dreamed of, a life without debt, without fear, had finally become a reality. That afternoon, Kwang and Dao went to the empty plot of land behind the farm. This was where they had planted the first seeds from the small packet at the hospital. The sprouts of mustard greens and sunflowers had begun to push themselves vigorously out of the soil. "Look, they're growing so fast," Dao said, her eyes sparkling with joy. "I used to think my life was like a seed forgotten in the dark, never destined to sprout again." Kwang stood beside her, gently taking her hand. This time, Dao did not hesitate or pull away. She squeezed his hand, feeling his warmth and steadiness. "Every seed needs time and the right hand to care for it at the right moment, Dao," Kwang mused. "From now on, you no longer have to fight the storms alone. I will tend to this garden with you, and to the life ahead of us as well." Under the brilliant golden sunset, the two figures stood leaning against each other amidst the sprouting garden. The water pumps hummed in the distance, but now it was no longer the monotonous sound of labor. It was the soundtrack of a home taking shape. The pain of the last 5 years had receded, giving way to the scent of beginnings and simple happiness.
Thank you so much for watching today's video until the very end. Your presence is the greatest gift to me. Every view and every moment you spend here is a huge motivation for me to keep improving and releasing higher quality content in the future. Creating content isn't easy, but your silent support gives me the strength to stay creative every day. If you found today's video interesting and relaxing, please don't hesitate to give me a like. Your small actions are the most precious recognition of our team's